What is happening to America when a middle-class family may have to spend more than $12,000 just to attend a few World Cup matches in their own country? That is not the only thing causing concern for many people. In the weeks leading up to kickoff, the biggest headlines were not about Messi, Mbappé, or the World Cup trophy. They were about visa delays, strict security measures, controversial ticket prices, and hotels that still had plenty of vacant rooms. And the closer you look, the more it feels as though the World Cup is not the biggest story here. The World Cup was supposed to be the biggest celebration in the history of soccer. When FIFA awarded the 2026 World Cup to the United States, Canada, and Mexico in 2018, the vision seemed almost perfect. This would be the first World Cup expanded from 32 to 48 national teams, with a total of 104 matches, more than any tournament before it. Expectations were enormous. When the United States hosted the World Cup in 1994, the tournament attracted more than 3.5 million spectators, a record that still stands today. As a result, many believed the 2026 edition would not only be successful, but could become the largest World Cup ever staged. More host cities, more visitors, more revenue. Millions of fans were expected to pour into North America for a soccer festival lasting several weeks. But with the opening match approaching, the headlines have not reflected the atmosphere of a global celebration. A FIFA referee selected to officiate matches was unable to enter the host country as planned. Individuals connected to the Iranian national team had to adjust their schedules because of administrative obstacles. Some members of coaching staffs from African national teams reported longer than expected screening and entry procedures. Meanwhile, many fans have begun to see a different reality. For a middle-class family, the cost of attending just a few matches can reach thousands, or even more than $10,000 once tickets, hotels, and transportation are included. Any one of these issues on its own may not constitute a crisis, but when they all appear at the same time, they begin to create an unusual feeling. Because normally, before a World Cup, people debate Messi, Mbappé, Bellingham. Which national team has the best chance of lifting the trophy? This time, many of the biggest debates are centered on visas, travel costs, hotel prices, security measures, and whether fans will actually be able to reach the tournament as easily as they once expected. This may be the first World Cup in which the biggest questions before kickoff revolve around how to get to the tournament rather than what will happen on the field. That is what makes the 2026 World Cup feel different. Not because soccer has changed, but because the biggest debates are taking place outside the stadiums. And when even international referees, national team personnel, and people directly involved with the tournament encounter barriers nobody expected, the world begins asking a simple question. If this is the experience of the people most important to the World Cup, what will the experience be like for an ordinary fan? Perhaps that is the moment when the story stops being just about the World Cup. Because the closer you look, the more it feels as though the unusual signs appearing before the tournament are merely the surface of a much larger story unfolding inside America. After all the controversy surrounding visas and border entry procedures, many people believe that is the biggest problem facing the 2026 World Cup. But perhaps they are looking in the wrong place. For months, FIFA has tried to reassure fans with solutions such as the FIFA Pass. In theory, the system was designed to make attending the tournament more convenient and reduce administrative hurdles. It sounds promising. But then reality enters the picture. A FIFA Pass may help someone schedule appointments more quickly and complete paperwork more easily, but it cannot guarantee that a visa will be approved. It cannot make airline tickets cheaper. It cannot lower hotel prices, and it certainly cannot help a family pay bills that keep getting more expensive. That is where the story begins to change. Because what truly worries many Americans is not whether a fan from Europe or South America will receive a visa. What worries them is that when they look at the World Cup, they begin to see their own lives reflected back at them. Imagine a father in Texas opening his laptop to plan a World Cup trip for his family. Just a handful of tickets, a hotel near the stadium, transportation, and meals can quickly push the total cost beyond $10,000 or even $12,000. For many families, that is no longer a weekend getaway. It is enough money to cover several months of rent, several months of insurance payments, or pay down a significant portion of the debt hanging over a credit card balance. Many people argue that the World Cup is becoming too expensive. But perhaps the more troubling question is whether America's middle class can still afford to enjoy things that were once considered normal. In recent years, financial pressure has appeared almost everywhere. Food prices remain significantly higher than they were before the pandemic. Insurance costs continue to climb in many states. Electricity bills, rent, and essential services consume a larger share of household budgets with each passing year. Meanwhile, total U.S. credit card debt has surpassed $1.2 trillion, the highest level ever recorded in the country's history. Never before have Americans carried so much credit card debt. That is why the World Cup is arriving at an especially sensitive moment. Not as a reward after years of hard work, but almost like a final bill being placed on the table. A bill that forces many families to sit down, look at their bank accounts, and realize they no longer have as many choices as they once did. Instead of debating Messi, Mbappé, or which national team will win the tournament, more and more people are asking a much simpler question: can they afford to be there at all? And that is what makes this story so notable. Many Americans will not be shut out of the World Cup because of visa issues. They will be shut out by their own bank accounts. The World Cup did not create this crisis. It is simply the first time millions of Americans have seen that crisis reflected in a ticket they can no longer afford to buy. Perhaps the most concerning part is not that the World Cup is becoming more expensive. It is that more and more Americans are beginning to see experiences that once felt completely normal as luxuries. What is surprising is that the 2026 World Cup does not lack interest. It is lacking people who are willing to attend in person. When FIFA awarded hosting rights to the United States, Canada, and Mexico in 2018, many cities prepared for what they believed would be the largest wave of visitors in World Cup history. Hotels expected to be fully booked. Restaurants prepared to hire additional staff. Local businesses anticipated billions of dollars flowing into the economy over just a few short weeks. On paper, everything looked perfect. But reality has turned out to be far more complicated. In some host cities, hotel bookings and travel demand have fallen short of what many businesses expected. That does not mean people no longer love soccer. Hundreds of millions of people around the world will still watch the matches. The problem is that more and more people are looking at the costs and asking whether the trip is still worth it. A family could easily spend between $8,000 and $15,000 on a World Cup trip. Once tickets, hotels, flights, and additional expenses are added together, for many people, that is no longer a vacation. It is a major financial decision. And when the amount of money becomes that large, uncertainty starts to matter. A fan from South Korea may choose to watch matches in Mexico instead. A Canadian family may decide to stay home. A European traveler may cancel plans at the last minute. They do not dislike soccer. They simply do not want to risk that much money on a trip filled with too many unknowns. That is why the story surrounding Iran's national team is more important than it may initially appear. When a national team has to adjust its plans because of administrative and travel-related obstacles, it sends a signal that many fans cannot ignore. If even a national team has to alter its plans because of factors outside the game itself, how will an ordinary fan feel about spending thousands of dollars on a trip of their own? In the travel industry, people do not buy a trip with money alone. They buy it with confidence. And once confidence begins to weaken, empty hotel rooms are merely the final symptom. The problem is not that people do not want to watch the World Cup. The problem is that more and more people are no longer certain the trip is worth the cost and risk involved. And that may be the most concerning sign of all. Because the World Cup does not lack fans. It is lacking people who still have enough confidence to make the journey. But perhaps the 2026 World Cup is exposing a problem that is bigger than costs, bigger than travel, and even bigger than soccer itself. It is uncertainty. For decades, America built its reputation on more than economic or military power. What made millions of people trust the United States was a very simple feeling. Things would work. You might disagree with the politics. You might not like the prices, but you trusted that the system would function as expected. You book a ticket. You board the plane. You arrive. You watch the match. You return home. That was the unspoken promise America once offered the world. But the 2026 World Cup is unintentionally revealing that this promise is no longer viewed as automatic. Over the past several years, debates surrounding immigration, border policy, race, and policies associated with President Donald Trump have generated very different reactions. Supporters have their views, critics have theirs. But the important question here is not who is right or wrong. What matters is that millions of people outside the United States have begun to feel less certain about America. That is a major change, because most people do not cancel a trip because they hate a country. They cancel a trip when they are no longer confident about what will happen after they spend the money. That is why the story is no longer about visas. Visas are merely a symptom, nor is it really about Iran's national team. Iran is simply an example. The real story is that uncertainty is appearing everywhere. If a fan is going to spend $10,000 or $15,000 on a World Cup trip, they need to feel confident that their plans will unfold as expected. But when stories about procedures, inspections, schedule changes, and ongoing controversies continue to surface, a question begins to form in many people's minds. Will everything actually happen the way I expect it to? That is the most dangerous question of all, because an expensive trip can still be worth it. A strict security process can still be accepted. Even minor inconveniences can be overlooked. But when certainty begins to disappear, even people who can afford the trip start to hesitate. That is why the biggest challenge facing the 2026 World Cup may not be ticket prices, not hotels, not FIFA, but the fact that more and more people are no longer sure what will happen after they spend their money. And that is a problem money alone has a very difficult time solving. A massive stadium can be built in a few years. A new hotel can open in a matter of months. But once trust is lost, it can sometimes take an entire generation to rebuild. Throughout the debate surrounding the 2026 World Cup, most of the attention has focused on visas, costs, travel, and uncertainty within the system. But another challenge is quietly approaching. And this time, no one can solve it simply by spending more money. It is the weather. Many of the host cities for the 2026 World Cup are located in regions experiencing increasingly frequent periods of extreme heat. Dallas, Houston, Miami, and Atlanta have all seen consecutive summers that have broken previous temperature records. On the hottest days, The heat index in some areas can exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 38 degrees Celsius, or higher. For a fan, that may sound like nothing more than a very hot day. But for a country preparing to welcome millions of visitors, it becomes an entirely different test. Because the World Cup does not take place only inside stadiums, it takes place at airports, train stations, public squares, and in long lines of people standing under the sun waiting to pass through security checkpoints. In other words, this tournament depends on an entire infrastructure system operating continuously for weeks under unprecedented pressure. That is where the story becomes especially interesting. For decades, whenever America faced a challenge, the response was often familiar: invest more. Need larger stadiums? Build them. Need more hotel rooms? Open more hotels. Need better roads? Upgrade the infrastructure. But temperature does not operate according to that logic. An aging power grid cannot instantly become stronger simply because additional funding is available. A cooling system cannot expand without limits in a matter of months, and a city experiencing record-breaking heat cannot simply flip a switch and make summer cooler. That is why a growing number of experts view the 2026 World Cup as a test of the future, not just for soccer, but for the ability of modern societies to adapt. The stadiums may still be packed. The matches may still take place exactly as planned. But behind the celebration is a much larger question. If even the wealthiest countries in the world begin struggling under the pressure of extreme weather, what happens to massive outdoor events 10, 20, or 30 years from now? Perhaps the 2026 World Cup will not only be the largest soccer tournament in history, it may also serve as one of the first reminders that there are limits. Money, technology, and power cannot easily overcome. Because some problems can be solved with money, but some limits are imposed by nature itself. After all the debates surrounding visas, costs, travel, and weather, the 2026 World Cup faces another challenge that receives far less attention: people. FIFA can generate billions of dollars in broadcasting revenue. It can run the largest sporting event on the planet and control almost everything that happens on the field. But there is one thing FIFA cannot create: the workforce required to keep everyday America running. The World Cup needs airport employees. It needs hotel workers. It needs security personnel. It needs drivers. It needs service staff. It needs tens of thousands of people working behind the scenes to ensure everything operates smoothly. The problem is that many American cities have been struggling with service sector labor shortages for years. Americans have seen it firsthand through restaurants closing earlier than they once did, stores reducing operating hours, hospitals constantly searching for additional staff, and airports facing ongoing pressure during peak travel seasons. This is not a new problem. The World Cup is simply arriving at a moment when an already strained system is being asked to absorb millions of additional visitors. And that may be the tournament's greatest paradox. People often assume the success of a World Cup is determined by FIFA, the national teams, or the multi-billion-dollar stadiums. But in reality, a visitor's experience is often determined by the people who are the least visible. A driver picking up travelers from the airport, a front desk employee working the night shift, a hotel housekeeper, a security worker standing in the heat for hours. The World Cup did not create this workforce crisis. It is simply the first time the entire world will step into a system that was already stretched beyond its limits. At this point, perhaps the most important story is no longer the World Cup itself. Because when you step back and look at the entire picture, from visas, costs, travel, climate, and workforce challenges, more and more people are beginning to realize that these issues are not completely separate from one another. they are all pointing in the same direction. For years, many people believed that the difficulties they were experiencing were only temporary. Food prices would eventually come down. Housing would become more affordable. Debt burdens would ease. Services would improve. Things would eventually return to the way they used to be. But that belief is becoming more fragile with each passing year. The World Cup has unintentionally become a mirror, reflecting something that millions of Americans have been feeling for a long time in their everyday lives. Longer lines, larger bills, higher debt, more expensive services that are not necessarily better. The father in Texas who cannot afford to take his family to the World Cup may not care much about FIFA, visas, or political debates, but he understands his grocery bill. He understands his insurance premiums, and he understands the balance on his credit card. That is exactly why the World Cup has become a story that is larger than soccer. Each individual change may not seem especially alarming on its own, but when they all appear together during an event the entire world is watching, they begin telling a different story. A story about a system being asked to do more with less room for error. What worries many people is not that a major crisis will suddenly appear tomorrow. It is the feeling that so many difficulties have existed for so long that they are beginning to look normal. And that may be the most thought-provoking sign of all. Because a real crisis does not begin when everything suddenly collapses. It begins when people start accepting decline as the new normal. The World Cup did not create America's cracks. It simply made the entire world see them all at once. When people talk about the World Cup, most think about FIFA, global sponsors, and multi-billion-dollar contracts. But the people with the most at stake are often the smallest players. A local restaurant owner, a family-run hotel, a souvenir shop, an Uber driver, a seasonal worker hoping to earn a few extra months of income to help pay end-of-year bills. That is where the domino effect begins. One person canceling a trip makes little difference. 10 people do not either. But when thousands, or tens of thousands, begin changing their plans, the entire business equation behind the World Cup starts to change as well. One group of fans cancels its trip. A travel company scales back its tour packages. A hotel reduces its expected occupancy. A restaurant sees fewer customers than anticipated. An Uber driver gets fewer rides. A seasonal worker loses an opportunity to earn extra income. That is how an individual decision gradually becomes a collective economic impact. What is especially notable is that many small businesses began preparing for the World Cup long before it arrived. They ordered additional inventory, hired more workers, extended their operating hours. Some even borrowed money with the belief that a wave of international visitors would help make it one of their most profitable years. But when visitor numbers fail to meet expectations, those investments begin turning into financial pressure. The restaurant owner does not just lose revenue. He still has to pay rent. He still has to pay wages. He still has to make payments on the loans used to prepare for the World Cup season. And that is the hardest part. The World Cup was expected to deliver an economic boost. But for many American small business owners, it risks becoming a reminder that the modern economy is far more fragile than it appears on the surface. At this point, perhaps the biggest question is no longer whether the 2026 World Cup will be a success or a failure. The bigger question is what happens next. Throughout this journey, we have moved through many different pieces of the puzzle. Visas, ticket prices, the cost of living, Iran's national team, climate challenges, labor shortages, empty hotel rooms, and growing debt. At first glance, they seem like separate stories, but when you put them together, they begin telling the same story. It is a story about confidence in a system's ability to function. The World Cup lasts only a few weeks, But the real test still lies ahead. Just 2 years later, Los Angeles will host the Olympic Games, a larger event, greater security demands, more visitors, and even higher expectations from the world. If a month-long tournament has already exposed so many pressures at the same time, what happens when America moves on to the next generation of global mega events? Perhaps that is what the world is really watching. Not whether Messi or Mbappé lifts a trophy, but whether America is still the country people instinctively trust to make things work as planned. The World Cup did not create America's cracks. It simply allowed the entire world to see them all at once. And if the World Cup is the first test, the Los Angeles Olympics may become the final exam for that confidence. When the 2026 World Cup comes to an end, the trophy will have a new champion. The greatest goals will be written into history, and most people will eventually forget many of the matches played during the tournament. But they may not forget what the World Cup unintentionally revealed, because from beginning to end, this was never just a story about soccer. It was a story about the cost of living, about trust, about infrastructure, about the new limits America is beginning to confront. The World Cup did not create those problems. It simply allowed the entire world to see them all at once. Are these merely temporary challenges facing a massive economy? Or are they signs that America has entered an entirely new chapter? Perhaps the answer will not be found on the field. Perhaps it lies in the things you are already witnessing every day. What do you think? Is this simply a temporary stumble? Or is it a sign of something much larger taking shape?